Hey everyone, so I'm Janie Helms and I will be doing a presentation on ion channels and their role in neuronal communication. So let's get started. So first I'm going to give you some background on electrical signals. And those electrical signals, they're pretty important because they have, they're the majority of how everything functions with ion channels and that neuronal communication, the whole point in this presentation. So the first thing I wanted to say was inside our body, and for animals, plants and animals, but I'm going to focus on the human body probably more specifically. The human body, you have all types of body cells, and every single cell has a plasma membrane, which means that that membrane has a certain potential or charge for it to function. There are certain types of cells that are considered excitable. So your nerve and your muscle cells are examples, and I'm going to focus on the importance of neurons with that communication between those cells. So neurons, they can receive electrical signals, send electrical signals, process what those signals mean, or just take them from one place and transmit them to another. So neurons are an extremely important part of the process in our body, and I'm going to talk about how these ion channels help with that and make that possible. There are two basic types of electrical signals. One is more proactive, more things, I don't want to say more things going on, but there's something forcing them to happen versus they naturally happen. So you have electrical signals that are graded or that they are action. So I'm going to show you this graph. I've always liked this graph. It shows a nice visual of how these charges work. And before I can talk about these charges and these words and how they apply to those channels and the communication, I need to break down the parts and what happens when charges or these signals occur. So ion channels cause ions to move in and out of the cell. An ion meaning a sodium ion, a calcium ion. They're going to want to move in and out of a cell. And depending on how they do that, that causes certain things to happen to the membrane potential. We know that sodium is a positive ion, or you have chlorine that is a negative ion. And depending on their movement in and out of the cell, that causes the charge to change. So on this graph, it shows that resting potential, so your membrane resting potential, is around -70 millivolts. Well, I like to say it's -60 to -70 because really there is a slight range, and depending on what you talk about, it could be closer to the -60 than -70. But for the sake of this picture has -70 millivolts. So that means that the inside, my membrane, and inside that cell, it's more negative. Well, if I have these ions that are positive move in, that causes that membrane potential to rise. Okay, if there's an influx in positives, I will move towards the positives. And we call that depolarization. Now, if I lose those positives and I'm going back towards my negatives, we say that I am repolarizing. I'm going through repolarization. And if that happens too much or too quick, I have this little spot here where we call that I'm hyperpolarized. I have way too many, or at least slightly too many negatives than I was supposed to have. But it will eventually balance out, and I'm back at my resting membrane potential. Now, what causes all these things to go up and down? It depends on what's happening in your body. It depends on what's happening in and outside of the cell. There's going to be some kind of triggering event that causes these channels to allow these ions to move in and out. So let's talk about the types of channels, their currents and how they work. So again, I said that there were two types. You have action potential, action electrical signals, and then you have graded. Action, we call their gated channels. Most of them are voltage gated, and they're going to respond according to some event. But then you also have the graded potential where, there's still a channel, it still opens and closes, but there's not an active electrical signal forcing those ions to move in and out. It's more of, if you think in physics, they talk about equilibrium and the law of thermodynamics, where everything moves from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. Everything moves from hot to cold, or everything moves from thick to thin. Everything moves from more condensed to less dense. So it's the same way, the way that these currents work, these channels. If the inside of that membrane is negative, those positives want to move in to get to them to find that balance. It doesn't want it to be negative. It wants it to be neutral. Now, whatever is causing these channels to open and close, we call them the trigger event. The stronger that event and the longer that event happens, the larger and longer those channels are going to remain open for that equilibrium to try and be reached. So here's some pictures to give you a better visual of what I just described. So you have the negative inside, positive outside. Right now the channel is closed. One cannot get from this side to the other. They're stuck where they are. So, but if I were to open, you can see that these positives start moving in. They want to get to the negatives. They want to try and reach that equilibrium. They want to go from higher to lower. And when they do that, they're going to continuously spread. They want to keep spreading from here to out here. They're going to try and spread all the way throughout everything, again, to reach equilibrium, to get them balanced. And again, we call that graded potential, because it just naturally spreads to try and spread out those positive and negatives evenly. Okay, so action potential. Again, I said that those, they're a voltage gated, so there's a more excitement, electrical signals, harder things that are going on. And they're going to involve the network of neurons. Now, neurons are made of a lot of different parts. When you learn about neurons, you learn about their axons, their dendrils, terminals, all these different parts. And what I'm going to talk about is how that network of neurons send electrical impulses from one place to the other. So I got two neurons, and I'm going to draw you a picture here in a minute, but I want to make sure you realize that neurons are not actually touching. They do not connect. So I have one neuron and another neuron spaced out. Now, it's not just empty space there. There are other things there. So I'm going to kind of talk you through while I draw this picture to explain that. So here's one neuron. Here's another neuron. If I can draw the letters good enough, I'm going to say that this is my presynaptic nerve. This is where my signal is going to start. And I want to get it all the way across here in this space to the postsynaptic nerve. This is where I want to send the signal. It needs to get from here to help my body function. So what happens is I get these electrical impulses that makes this area over here with the presynaptic nerve, it makes it swell. And when it swells, it forces out these little synaptic knobs. And these knobs, I'm going to show you a little later, they contain certain signals, certain parts, or a neurotransmitter. Now, that's not the only thing I need. In between this space, and the space is called the synaptic cleft, but in this area, there are these kind of intertangling, twining, finger-like adhesion molecules. And they are called cams. So they're not touching, yet in some way they kind of are. So you have these cams, and between the signal coming from here, coming through these knobs, transmitting through the cams, eventually it will get all the way over here to the postsynaptic postsynaptic neuron, and that signal will have been sent. So this is the basic, the very basic layout to say I can get an electrical impulse from one neuron to another. And there are more parts to that. So let's move on to the next slide, where I'm going to give to you kind of the bigger picture. I'm going to bring in the ion channels, the entire cell, as well as those two neurons that I just mentioned. So we're going to look at the big picture. Okay, first of all, 4 ion channels that are the most important. That is what controls all these things in our body to send these signals. You have sodium, potassium, chlorine, and calcium. And in this picture, you can see those. Here's an example of these 4 channels. Sodium and calcium are generally a lot higher outside of the cell than inside. Same with chlorine. Potassium being the one that is higher inside the cell. Up here at the top of the cell, we see another, we call it an ATP pace pump. And an ATP pace pump allows, through that one pump, to bring in 2 potassium ions, but at the same time lose 3 sodium ions. So that means I'm losing more positives than I'm gaining. And that can kind of help with that negative internal charge. So all these channels, they open and close. They open and close depending on what trigger event is occurring. You know, is there some kind of stress on the body? Do I need a signal to tell my muscles to contract? All of these channels, they have to be timed, and they are timed. If your body is functioning properly, they are timed perfectly so that those signals get from neuron to neuron, meaning that those signals are sent through your nervous system. These signals tell your muscles to contract. These signals tell your heart when to pump and beat. They also tell the other parts of your body, like your senses, your sense of taste and hearing and smelling, all those signals in your head that make those things possible. They are controlled by the perfect timing of the opening and closing of these channels. Now, let's do a lot more fancier big picture of that picture that I drew of the 2 neurons. Again, the 2 neurons are not actually physically touching. There is a space. Okay, there is a space between them, but there has to be a way for things to help get from here to here. So I always think this picture looks like 2 bones, but this is representing the presynaptic neuron. Down here is your postsynaptic neuron, so it's going to take the message. This one is sending the message. So I'm going to start in order, step by step, combining the ion channels with the transmitting of the message from the picture that I drew a minute ago with the 2 neurons. So first, depolarization has to occur, and that occurs by sodium channels opening up. The sodium channels open, they move inside the nerve cell, and not even a second, I mean you get milliseconds later, you have potassium moving out. So there's enough time for sodium to move in to cause depolarization. But a split second later, now you're losing some of those positives, so repolarization is occurring. Now after that, you get another set of channels open. you have the calcium channels, and they're going to open and move in, and between the sodium and the calcium inside there, they are going to move along with the neurotransmitter that is called acetylcholine. Right here, the acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that it kind of bunches up in these little vesicles here. And these little open spaces, these vesicles, can kind of represent the synaptic knob that I drew on my picture. And they allow for that neurotransmitter containing that electrical signal to move across this space where those cams are located in that synaptic cleft. It's going to move them from here all the way across. Now, what I didn't mention on the last picture is that I just said they move straight across and they get to where they need to go. But more specifically, they get where they need to go because there are receptors that are specifically made to grab a hold and bind with that specific neurotransmitter. So you have these receptors, they bind with that signal, and now you have the signal sent from this neuron to the next. At the same time, you also have the sodium and calcium entering in as well with those receptors. So that is how, with a nice big colorful picture, explain how these channels play a part in that neuronal communication, how signals go from one nerve to another, from one neuronal cell to the next one. So I said that I had a receptor for that specific neurotransmitter. Well, there are two main categories. The first one is called ionotropic. Ionotropic is specifically for ion channels, and I already gave you one example, but let's talk about some other examples or some other neurotransmitters that have their specific receptors. You have serotonin and glutamate. These neurotransmitters, they are going to cause the depolarization because they are connected to the positive ion channels. So the sodium, the calcium, and the potassium. So there are specific receptors for each one of those. The chlorine ion channel is negatively charged. So glycine is a neurotransmitter that connects or acts as a receptor for those channels. Now, the second type of neuron receptor is metabotropic. This is kind of like a second stage, a second level receptor. It generates a second message to be sent somewhere. So once that signal goes into the cell, now these receptors take them somewhere else. So it's inside the cell, and those are specifically related to like your olfaction, your vision, your sense, your taste, those sensory details of your body. Those are secondary messengers inside the cell. So again, specific receptors for the appropriate neurotransmitter. Now this is just the process of neuron signal, meaning, let's sum up a little bit. Okay, so I have a single neuron. It gets some kind of information, gets a signal from somewhere else, some other neuron. So it gets a signal. A specific neurotransmitter is released depending on what that signal is for. And it takes that, and the cell responds accordingly. It takes that signal and goes and sends it where it needs to go because of what it is. And each thing has a specific job. And as that bottom bullet point says, the cell responds with action potential, meaning those voltage gated channels are opened or closed according to how much and what specifically needs to move from neuron to neuron. Now, as amazing as these ion channels are, they make our body function. Like I said in the previous slides, those signals that pass through these channels, they determine our heart beating, our muscles contracting, being able to move every part of your body. For me to be able to hear this, see it, all of these ion channels play this important role. However, there are natural toxins in nature that prevent these from happening in our body. And as horrible as that sounds, you have to keep in mind, nature loves balance. For every good, there's a bad. Okay? For every bad, there's a fix. I always remember hearing growing up that everywhere in nature, if there is a poisonous plant, there is another plant or whatever cures it or subsides those symptoms from it right next to it. Okay, they're not far away. So as plants go, those can be found in nature, balance. But let's talk about animals. So there are specific toxins that other animals, not humans, but other animals, that they put out. For their case, it's to protect themselves. If they can release this toxin into a predator, something that's trying to harm them, it can allow them to get away. Or let's say that they're, not super large or strong, but they can release this toxin into this other animal and incapacitate it, which means they're able to actually feed and survive. They're able to live because of what they can do. So I'm going to break down some animals. You can see right here the specific toxin and what it actually affects as our channels go. So there is something called a cone snail, and there's actually two types, two different species of it, but they both release a type of conotoxin, and those affect our calcium channels. They prevent them from functioning. So over here where I have binding site, these toxins will target in some way these channels. So when I have the word pore, there are these inside the ion conduction channel, there's pores in there. And these toxins will bind to them, preventing the flow of those ions. Or down here I have voltage sensors. They bind to the gated channel, preventing that voltage, preventing that opening and closing what's supposed to happen. So we have a cone snail that affects our calcium channels. A type of cyanobacteria, their toxin is called saxitoxin, and it affects our sodium and potassium. The pufferfish, I feel like that's the one that I had heard of. Besides, I knew spiders and scorpions, but the actual name for the pufferfish, I have actually heard of that toxin. I don't know why that is so relevant, but that seems to be the only one I've ever actually heard of. So it's called the tetrodotoxin, and it specifically affects our sodium channels. 5 types of scorpions. I mean, there's many types of species where, depending on the species, they release a specific toxin, and that specific toxin affects a certain channel, or more than one channel. So between all these scorpions, they can affect every type of positive ion channel. Same with spiders. Tarantula is an example, is one species of spider that can release a toxin that incapacitates their prey. Now, again, what that means, if these ions, if these channels are not able to open and close like they're supposed to, okay, if they can't open, that means my electrical signals cannot be sent from neuron to neuron. I cannot tell my muscles to contract, okay? A lot of the times when you hear or watch the animal kingdom, you see that the animal just goes limp. When they're bitten by the snake or stung by the spider, they just go limp. your mind, your body, those ion channels cannot send the signal to tell your skeletal muscles to contract, so you can't fight back. There's no force left in your body. So with these ion channels being prevented from functioning, same with your heart. If those ion channels can't open and you can't get the signal for your heart to pump, you die. For these animals, it's the way they survive. So, again, ion channels, they are the reason our body can function in so many ways, because our nervous system helps send these signals to help our body function. And there are ways. Scientists have studied these animals. They have studied with these toxins to see how they affect their our body and how they affect their channels. So we know why and how it works, which is also a good thing, that if we understand how they work, doctors can find cures for them. They can rid them of our body, or they can save our life because they can do the antitoxin. They can treat that toxin that's in your body to save your life if you are ever bitten or stung or come in contact with one of these animals. And then these are my references. Thank you, and I hope you learn and understand a little more about ion channels and how they play a role in neuronal communication.